The following talk is sponsored by the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. If you're watching the video on YouTube, please take a moment and subscribe to the Academy YouTube channel. You can always access the channel by going to classicalliberarts.com/YouTube. We hope that you enjoy the lesson. God bless. Today is Tuesday, July 11th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This year, as we take some important steps forward in developing the Academy, now that I've made the preceptor training course available, and it's available at no cost to anyone who's interested in studying it, I'm going to move on to sort of a new focus on the methods of study in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. There are three important activities that I'd like to talk about in this talk, which I'm going to emphasize in the Academy as we try to help the students learn how to study more effectively. Now, all of us have studied, so it's something that we can all think about, talk about, reflect on. And I'm sure that you've experienced the problem where you read a paragraph or even just a sentence, get to the end of it, and realize, I have no idea what I just read. It happens to me quite a bit when I'm praying the Liturgy of the Hours, because I may not be careful to quiet my mind, and as St. Francis de Sales says, enter into God's presence when I begin praying. Sometimes I'll just jump into my daily prayers right out of busy activity with work, and what I noticed is, and I'm sure you'll notice this as well, and I'm sure you'll have experienced this, is that our minds are so powerful that we can be thinking of one thing and saying something else. There are times where I've recited, even chanted a psalm, come to the end of the psalm and realized that while I've just chanted that entire psalm, my mind wasn't paying attention at all to the words of the psalm. My mind was on one thing and my mouth was chanting something else. It's really amazing to see how our minds are able to do that. And so we see that speaking and thinking are not connected. They have to be connected. We've got to consciously connect them. And this is one of the problems with studying. Students will often read something, but they're not studying it. They're going through the motion, they're reading the words with their mouth, but they're not thinking about what they're studying. And we've got to learn to correct this. But first, I want to ask you to do a little experiment to see what I'm talking about. I'd like you to challenge yourself to do this. After I get done explaining what to do, hit pause on this talk, try it, and then continue listening. I'd like you to sing the Happy Birthday song. Sing it 3 or 4 times. And as you're singing it, as you're singing Happy Birthday, think about different things. Think about going to the beach. Think about celebrating Christmas. Think about throwing a ball around on the lawn. And while you're thinking about these different things, continue singing the Happy Birthday song. And continue working on that, because you'll see that you're able to sing a song while you think about something different. The processes of thinking and speaking are disconnected. And this is what often happens when we're assigned to read something. we'll read through it. And what we're actually doing is we're reading the words out loud. But what we're not doing is taking in the ideas that are being expressed in the sentences. We're reading the words, but we're not receiving the ideas. And this is why we can get to the end of a passage and think and say, I have no idea what I just read. And so reading is not studying. Reading is not studying. Now, what I've done in my daily prayers, because this is where I experience this the most, what I've done to eliminate this is I no longer read or chant the prayers by looking at the words. What I do is I look at a line of a psalm, I get the line in my mind, and then I recite it without looking at the text. Again, I'll look at the line, get it in my mind, and then look away from the book and recite the line, relying on my memory of it to recite it. And I'll do that line by line. I won't read word by word. I will recite line by line. I force myself to make sure that I think about the words of the line, look away from the page, continue thinking about the words of the line, and then recite them based on what's in my mind, not what I see on the page. And this eliminates that problem of reading without paying attention. Because again, speaking the words is all that's necessary for reading. And we can do this one word at a time, with our minds totally disengaged. But to think about a whole sentence which represents a complete thought, to look at the text, not read it out loud, but simply think about it and absorb it into our mind, if you will, then look away and reproduce it or recite it. Recite what's actually in our thoughts, not on the paper. This extra step allows us to avoid this problem of reading without paying attention. Now, I know that students in the academy do this all the time. They'll be assigned, and this is partly my fault because I don't make this clear enough in the instructions, but I'll assign the children to read a lesson, and they'll do that. They'll follow the instructions, and they will read a lesson out loud. But they will not be thinking about the lesson. They will not be receiving the ideas expressed in the sentences. They'll simply be mouthing the words. And so they'll check the box and say, there, I completed that task. I read chapter 1. But they haven't engaged with the text. They haven't studied. They've simply read the words out loud. So what I'm going to be doing this year in as many courses as I can is I'm going to be adding tasks to the lessons that are more specific. I'm going to be focusing on individual paragraphs, individual articles in the different lessons, and I'm going to be assigning the students to recite the lessons. And recitation is very important. If you go back and study any textbooks or teacher manuals, I mean, you may not do this, but I certainly do this, you'll find that recitation was one of the most common exercises of the students in the schools. You'll see this. You'll see recitation. And if you wonder, what's the purpose of recitation? This is the purpose of recitation. If a teacher wants to know that the students are learning the content, she can't ask them to read the lesson. So if we were in a classroom, I can't simply say, Thomas, would you read the first 2 sentences for us, and then have Thomas read it out loud in the classroom, and then assume that Thomas or any of the other students were paying attention. And so what the teacher would normally do is the teacher might have someone read or would read herself, and then she would call on the students to recite what was read. Sometimes she'd give them some time to review the material, but she would call upon the children to recite the lines that they were studying. If it was a catechism, we can understand. They would be asked the question and asked to recite the answer. And this is what it means to recite. It means to state what has been read and studied without looking at the text. That is, it's relying on what's actually in our minds. And the ability to recite proves that we have mentally engaged with the content of the lesson, because a kid who merely reads the words out loud will not be able to recite afterwards. And so recitation becomes a simple, measurable activity that allows us to teach our children how to study and also to assess that they have, in fact, studied. So I'm going to be emphasizing recitation much more, and I encourage you to do so as well as parents. When the children are studying, and catechism provides us with a very simple example, ask the children to recite their lessons, recite the lines, recite the rules, recite the answers to the catechism questions, and so on. We want to make sure the children are engaging mentally, and the way that we can do this is by asking them to recite. So that's something we're going to emphasize, and I want you to see that there are two different activities, reading and reciting. Now, reciting is sort of an intermediary step between reading and memorizing. Memorizing has a different purpose. Reciting has a temporary purpose. We're not asking the children to commit everything that they read or study to memory permanently. Recitation is simply asking them to prove that they've engaged with the material mentally. Memorization is a third activity. When we ask a child to memorize something, it's assumed that the knowledge being memorized is something that we want the children to carry with them permanently. And therefore, we have to be very careful with what we ask the children to memorize, because memorization is a different level of activity. It requires much more time, much more effort, and the results are long-lasting. So, for example, if we're studying the catechism, we may want the children to memorize the catechism. And what that means is to study it so carefully and thoroughly that a child may be asked a week later or a month later or a year later to answer a catechism question, and they will still be able to give the answer. That's memorization. And so we want to make a distinction between these three different activities. Reading, which doesn't require any engagement of the mind at all with the ideas that are being studied. Reading is the first activity. Recitation is the second activity, and that's more of a short-term test of the student's engagement. The student should be allowed to look over the text, to study it for a bit, and then look away from the text and recite the content of the lesson. And then thirdly, memorization is long-term engagement where the student studies so carefully and the content is recited so intensely that it's hard to forget it even months or years into the future. So we want to distinguish between reading, reciting, and memorizing. Reading is really not accomplishing anything. Reciting is very helpful as an objective way to test that the students are studying. Memorizing is too much work for most of what needs to be studied, but is important for those lessons which we really want the children to keep with them permanently. And so we want to make this distinction between reading, reciting, and memorizing. As I continue to improve our courses, I'm going to begin directing the children to recite different parts of their lessons as they go through. So let's say they're studying article number 10 in arithmetic. I'll give the instruction for the student to read and recite article 12. And so that will be the challenge for them to be able to read it, look away from the text, and recite it. Now, this is something that parents can easily assess, and this is the kind of work that parents need to do to help their children while they're studying. What's good about it for parents is that parents are able to help their children with content that they have not studied in the past. And so when a parent desires to give his child an education that's better than his own, one of the problems there is that the parent doesn't know how to teach or what to teach, where recitation doesn't ask the parent to teach anything. It simply asks the parent to observe and see whether or not the child is able to recite what's in the text without looking at the text. So it's good for parents because it gives them something objective that they can do that doesn't require this education in them. So they're free from any negative consequences of their own modern education. So recitation and memorization, two important activities that are different and serve different purposes. But recitation really needs to become the normal way that children study their lessons. It's something that the kids have to challenge themselves with, and it's something that the parents have to challenge the kids with as well. So when they're told to study a certain rule or a certain lesson, what they need to do is read that lesson, surely, but they need to read it with their minds engaged, and then they need to look over the text, internalize the text, then look away from the text and recite the text. That's a good way to make sure the kids are engaged mentally. So you're going to see those instructions in the Academy task lists as I improve the lessons that are in our online courses. And I wanted to discuss this because I wanted to be clear what the difference is between recite and memorize. And I think you'll understand that. But again, I want you to take the time to experiment and see what I'm talking about. Sing a song and observe how your mind can be thinking about something else while your vocal organs are singing a song or reciting a poem. The ability to read or speak and think separately is pretty amazing. And to go even further, think about the fact that you're actually observing yourself think about something else while you say something else. And you see that this can go on and on. You can observe yourself observing yourself thinking about something while saying something. And you can observe yourself observing yourself observing yourself thinking about something while you're saying something else. This is what's really amazing about the human mind, is its ability for self-observation. And the fact that our mind can do this is awesome when we consider the power of our thoughts, but it also is a problem that we need to pay attention to when it's time to study, because we can be saying the words of the lesson, but not actually be studying them. So I want parents and students to try to make an effort this year to make sure that we're studying by reciting everything we study. So that's what I wanted to share. I'm going to be adding those tasks to the course lessons so you'll see them and understand what they mean. If you've got any questions about these things, about reading, reciting, and memorizing, just let me know. I'm happy to talk about these practical details of studies. God bless. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy works to research, restore, publish, and teach the classical Catholic curriculum enjoyed by wise men and saints throughout history. To join us for classical Catholic studies or to learn more about the programs available, visit classicalliberalarts.com.